Now, the Beaufighter might not share the limelight with legends like the Supermarine Spitfire or the Aviation Mosquito, but its contributions to the Allies in World War II were absolutely critical. With its heavy armament, rugged build, and surprising versatility, this heavy fighter that shouldn't have succeeded carved out an illustrious service history, leaving an indelible mark on multiple fronts. So without further ado, let's take a journey through its lineage, starting from the Bristol Blenheim. Now, before we jump into the Bristol story, let's clarify what we mean by lineage. Aviation lineages can be direct or indirect. A classic example of indirect lineage is the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II. While both share the Thunderbolt name and a general ground attack fighter role, they're separated by decades of advances in design philosophies, new manufacturing techniques, and even changes in aeronautical requirements. In essence, these two aircraft are spiritual successors rather than mechanical or design-driven derivatives. Now, in contrast, direct lineages evolve when one airframe is iteratively modified to serve a new role or to take advantage of upgraded engines, better avionics, or improved aerodynamic research. The real DNA of the older machine is visibly and tangibly passed on. That's exactly the case that we have with the Bristol Blenheim, the Bristol Beaufort, and the Bristol Beaufighter. The Beaufighter inherited critical design elements, engineering philosophies, and even entire assemblies from its immediate predecessor, the Beaufort, which then in turn evolved from the Blenheim. Distinguishing these lineages matters because it offers a clear look at how wartime necessity drives rapid technological evolution. Now, seeing these incremental steps helps us understand why certain design choices were made, how resources got reused, and how prototypes were rushed into service, sometimes before being properly tested. This is particularly important for middle-aged avionic enthusiasts who may appreciate the deeper engineering story behind an aircraft's inception and transformation, rather than just the headlines about how many bombs it dropped or ships it sank. Now, as we discuss each aircraft in the lineage, keep in mind that design decisions weren't made in a vacuum. Rather, each plane served as a stepping stone for the next, carrying forward lessons learned, proven components, and yes, plenty of headaches that had to be engineered out. Now, the narrative starts in the mid-1930s with an unlikely catalyst, a British newspaper called the Daily Mail. Its owner, Lord Rothermere, had big dreams of propelling British aviation into a new era. He was convinced that the UK was trailing behind other nations in high-speed commercial air travel and saw an opportunity to spur innovation by offering a challenge to the British aviation industry. Lord Rothermere wanted a passenger plane that could fly faster than any contemporary airliner in service, challenging engineers to develop a truly world-class aircraft. He proposed an ideal top target speed of 250 miles an hour, a velocity that, at the time, seemed a bit lofty for a passenger plane, especially given the era's typical reliance on slower biplane designs or older monoplane technology. Bristol Airplane Company rose to the challenge. Its talented chief designer had recently visited the U.S. to study monoplane passenger aircraft. With this knowledge, he produced the Type 135, a twin-engine monoplane design. Bristol initially hesitated, but an intermediary, Robert Lewis, working for Rothermere, suggested upgrading the engines to Bristol Mercury supercharged engines, effectively boosting the speed closer to Rothermere's goal. The improved design became known as the Type 142, and though originally intended for civil use, it flew on April 12th of 1935 under the moniker Britain First. The day it took to the skies, it surpassed everyone's expectations, achieving about 300 miles an hour, blowing well past its initial 250 mph target. It was a shockingly high number back in 1935, especially for a plane that was basically a civilian transport in concept. Now, for context, much of the Royal Air Force, or RAF, was still using biplanes or other comparatively outdated designs that struggled to reach speeds anywhere near 300 miles an hour. This demonstration of raw performance put pressure on the British military to modernize. It was a wake-up call. If a press mogul's custom passenger plane could blow RAF biplanes out of the water, or air in this case, something really had to change. The RAF was immediately intrigued. They saw the potential for turning the sleek civilian design into a bomber that could outpace contemporary fighters. However, military conversions are rarely straightforward. They need a bomb bay, defensive turrets, and a new cockpit layout to accommodate military avionics and crew responsibilities. The resulting aircraft was the Type 142M, which the RAF dubbed as the Bristol Blenheim Mark I. As the old adage goes, every pound you add costs you speed and range. Sure enough, loading up the Blenheim with turrets, bombs, and additional armor trimmed its top speed from the mind-boggling 300 miles an hour to a still impressive 281 miles an hour. In 1936, 281 miles an hour was fast for a twin-engine light bomber, and the RAF, fully aware of rising global tensions, placed an order for 150 Blenheims in September of 1935. notably before the Blenheim prototype had ever taken its first flight. The Blenheim's first official flight in bomber configuration happened on June 25th of 36. The RAF ended up purchasing over 4,400 units, cementing the Blenheim as one of the early workhorses in Britain's modernizing bomber fleet. However, as the years rolled on and the war began, the pace of technological advancement in fighter aircraft soon threatened the Blenheim's initial speed advantage. Early in World War II, Blenheims were deployed in a variety of roles: daylight bombing missions, night fighter duties, and reconnaissance. They performed valiantly, but suffered high losses due to relatively light defensive armament and diminishing speed advantages against cutting-edge enemy fighters. The planes were, quite simply, outmatched by rapid developments in German aircraft design. Yet, despite the shortcomings, the Blenheim offered an invaluable lesson. Speed was crucial, but so was adapting quickly to evolving military needs. The theme of flexible adaptation would continue as we followed the lineage into the next aircraft, the Beaufort. Now, when the Blenheim found its place as a light bomber, the British Air Ministry soon realized that they had an urgent requirement for a torpedo bomber that could handle reconnaissance missions. The existing biplane torpedo bombers, like the Fairey Swordfish, were becoming increasingly vulnerable as aircraft technology raced forward. Bristol took the Blenheim's design as the foundation and began making changes to adapt it for maritime strikes. The result was designated the Type 150, which significantly moved the cockpit forward and repositioned the turret closer to the tail. The new version added space for a third crew member, intended initially as a radio operator and all-around extra pair of hands in a complex maritime environment. Yet the transformations didn't stop there. The airplane further evolved into the Type 152, which offered space for a fourth crew member, typically a navigator or a specialized operator for maritime missions. The power plant switched to a more potent, at least on paper, Bristol Taurus engine, which theoretically provided better performance than a Mercury engine. In August of 36, the RAF placed an order of 78 Beauforts, aiming to expand maritime strike capabilities. However, the path to production was anything but smooth. The Taurus engines often experienced overheating problems and reliability hiccups that delayed the entire production schedule. Compounding the issue, Britain was distributing aircraft production facilities across multiple locations to protect them from enemy bombing, which was especially pressing once war seemed imminent. This decentralization slowed output, leading to additional supply chain headaches. The first Beaufort finally took flight on October 15th of 1938, a date that might seem sufficiently early for World War II, but this was actually behind schedule given the rising global tensions in the late 30s. Despite the hurdles, the Beaufort eventually proved quite adequate for its primary mission: torpedo bombing. It served effectively in anti-shipping strikes, and the plane's overall performance did get a bit overshadowed in historical texts by more famous aircraft like the Swordfish or later innovations, but the Beauforts were still solid. Now, when people think of World War II torpedo bombers, the Beaufort rarely tops the list, partly because it arrived at a time when multiple other designs were fighting for the same mission profile. But the Beaufort was key in bridging a technological gap. Its design improvements, especially the revised wing structure, landing gear, tail assembly, it all paved the way for the next big leap: the Beaufighter. Crucially, the Beaufort program also honed Bristol's ability to adapt existing designs under the harsh constraints of wartime production. This mindset of use what we have, tweak it fast, and get it out there would become more pronounced as the war escalated and Britain faced existential threats from the German Luftwaffe. Now, by the late 30s, the British Air Ministry recognized an urgent need for a heavy fighter. The German Luftwaffe had exemplified the utility of twin-engine heavy fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110, and Britain was lagging in that department. Designing a brand new aircraft from scratch would take years, time that the British simply didn't have, especially after the Munich Agreement of 1938 intensified the sense of impending conflict. Enter the Beaufighter. Initially known as the Type 156, Britain leveraged major Beaufort components, including wings, landing gear, and tailplane, to rapidly prototype a new fighter. They discarded the Beaufort's bulky fuselage, which was optimized for a torpedo and bomb bay, and replaced it with a more streamlined structure suited for carrying heavy cannons, radar equipment, and a crew of two: a pilot and a radar operator, or a navigator. Now, while it's easy to say that this was a bit of a hodgepodge of existing parts, the design work was complex. The aerodynamic requirements for a heavy fighter capable of intercept missions or night fighting are starkly different from those of a torpedo bomber. However, reusing components meant that the project advanced in record time. The initial plan was to fit the Beaufighter with Bristol Hercules engines, robust sleeve valve radials that could produce impressive horsepower. Early prototypes suggested 335 miles an hour top speed. Now, once the third prototype arrived, loaded with armament, ammo, and all military gear, top speed did drop a bit to 309 miles an hour, but that's still respectable for a heavy fighter in 1939. The question was whether the Hercules engine supply would meet the RAF's desperate demand. Now, when engine shortages loomed, Bristol created the Beaufighter Mark II, powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engine. This variation helped ensure production wouldn't bottleneck if Hercules engines became scarce. For a time, Britain ended up with parallel lines of Beaufighters sporting different types of engines, an illustration of how dire and immediate the RAF's needs were. By mid-1940, the Battle of Britain was all underway. Britain needed every capable airframe that it could muster. The RAF ordered nearly 1,000 Beaufighters, which was an enormous vote of confidence in an aircraft that was still ironing out the kinks in pre-production. Early versions were armed with a jaw-dropping array of 4 20mm cannons in the nose, and then later adding a 6 .303 caliber machine gun. In an unusual asymmetric layout across the wings, 4 on one side, 2 on the other. This made the Beaufighter arguably the most heavily armed British aircraft of World War II at that time. Now, although the aircraft's maximum speed was nothing like the single-engine speedsters of the day, the Beaufighter's firepower, range, and multi-role adaptability made it indispensable. The British had effectively conjured a stopgap that ended up being so effective it stuck around for years, much longer than many official long-term projects. One of the most dramatic chapters of the Beaufighter's history involves the Coastal Command and its strike wings, which primarily targeted German maritime operations. Coastal Command recognized the need to disrupt the Kriegsmarine operations, especially the menacing U-boats that threatened Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The Beaufighter, with its heavy armament and robust construction, was the ideal platform for a low-level attack, not just with cannons, but eventually with rockets and torpedoes as well. These strike wings would fly in coordinated groups, often skimming just above the waves, unleashing a barrage of cannon fire, rockets, or torpedoes on German ships. Such operations required both skill and a lot of bravery. Any mistake in low-level attacks could result in a crash or heavy losses to naval anti-aircraft guns. It's worth noting that one of the greatest menaces to Allied shipping in the Atlantic was a German U-boat. Now, the strike wings, led by Beaufighters and other aircraft, aimed to whittle down this U-boat fleet and safeguard the convoys that were Britain's lifeline. One standout example was the sinking of U-418 using the strike wing's most feared weapon, air-to-surface rockets. These rockets, once relegated to ground attack roles, proved alarmingly effective against surface submarines and even surface vessels. The Beaufighter's stable low-level flight profile and punchy armament load made it a nightmare for U-boat captains that were caught on the surface. As the war progressed, the strike wings grew in size and capability. They didn't restrict themselves to just U-boats, they targeted virtually every Kriegsmarine ship that they could find. This extended to merchant shipping that supplied the German war machine, hitting convoys, supply vessels, and smaller patrol craft. By cutting off Germany's maritime supply lines, the Coastal Command's Beaufighters contributed to the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that history books sometimes kind of underemphasize. But while the strike wings were wreaking havoc on enemy shipping, the Beaufighter found itself in other covert or unusual operations too. One of the boldest was Operation Squabble, a daring, almost insane mission carried out by a single Beaufighter. This mission was intended to drop a literal bag of propaganda leaflets, yes, leaflets, over occupied Paris. So why is that so crazy? Well, because flying a single aircraft into heavily defended enemy territory in broad daylight was, well, to put it lightly, a very risky proposition. And yet, the mission was really successful, proving again that the Beaufighter's range, speed, and ruggedness could be adapted for tasks that no one initially envisioned. It's these surprising stories that help solidify the Beaufighter's reputation as the heavy fighter that shouldn't have succeeded, but it did. Now, though the Beaufighter is often associated with British forces, it also saw service under various Allied air arms, including the Royal Australian Air Force and others who needed a hard-hitting and long-range platform. One of the most famous claims is that the Japanese dubbed the Beaufighter Whispering Death, allegedly because of the relatively quiet approach of its sleeve valve Hercules engines. Now, while there's some debate about the authenticity of that nickname's origin, there is no denying that Beaufighters had a formidable reputation in the Pacific theater. Their ability to perform effective low-level strikes against Japanese shipping, airfields, and ground targets made them a valuable asset to the Allied war effort. The Australian squadrons in particular found the Beaufighter ideally suited for the harsh conditions of the Southwest Pacific. The plane's durable airframe and powerful armament overcame various operational difficulties, ranging from tropical weather to rough forward airstrips. Now, in the Mediterranean, Beaufighters were used for coastal patrol, anti-shipping missions, and even ground attack sorties against Axis forces in North Africa. Their extended range helped them cover vast expanses of water and desert. In these theaters, flexibility was the name of the game. A Beaufighter squadron might conduct shipping strikes in the Mediterranean, and the next, they'd be strafing convoys in the North African desert. Among the more interesting roles that the Beaufighter took on was night fighting. When the Battle of Britain was drawing to a close, the Luftwaffe shifted to nighttime bombing raids against British cities, a strategy known as the Blitz. Britain needed a stable twin-engine platform that could carry bulky airborne radar sets without sacrificing too much performance. The Beaufighter was the perfect candidate. Now, some of the earliest dedicated night fighter variants, like the Beaufighter Mark IF and Mark VIF, sported sophisticated radar systems for the time. Now, armed with 20mm cannons and machine guns, these night fighters hunted down Luftwaffe bombers in the dark skies. Pilots often had to rely heavily on ground-based radar detection and their own rudimentary onboard radar scopes. Despite the challenging conditions, over 70 Beaufighter pilots eventually became aces, a testament to how effectively the aircraft performed in the night skies. Now that we've touched on some of the aircraft's operational achievements, let's dive a bit deeper into the design and engineering elements that made the Beaufighter surprisingly successful. The reuse of Beaufort components was both a strength and a limitation. On one hand, using existing wings, landing gear, and tail assemblies meant that the aircraft could be put into production quickly. But on the other hand, the fuselage design had to be carefully tailored to accommodate heavy cannons and a second crewman for radar operation. The final product was sturdy and capable of taking a beating, which was often essential for low-level attacks and night operations. While early variants struggled with engine availability, the Hercules engines eventually matured into powerful, reliable units that allowed the Beaufighter to carry a massive payload of cannons, machine guns, rockets, or torpedoes. Later Hercules versions produced well over 1,600 horsepower each, giving the Beaufighter the thrust it needed to haul heavy armaments. Its top speed ranged from 300 to 320 miles an hour, depending on variant and loadout. Reports claimed it could exceed 1,500 miles with drop tanks, making it ideal for a maritime strike and deep interdiction missions. The Beaufighter's trademark was its firepower. The nose-mounted 4 20mm Hispano cannons delivered a devastating punch. Some variants added up to 6 .303 caliber machine guns in the wings, which created a forward-facing hurricane of lead and explosive shells. When you factor in the possibility of underwing rockets or torpedoes slung under the belly, it's clear why the Beaufighter excelled as a strike platform. But despite the unorthodox wing-gun arrangement, some had guns in only one wing or more guns in one wing than another, the overall offensive potential was among the best of any Allied aircraft. This made it a multifaceted tool, from anti-fighter or bomber duties to smashing ground and naval targets. Britain was a pioneer in radar, and the Beaufighter's spacious nose and two-seat arrangement allowed for an onboard radar operator. This technology was crucial in the night fighter role. Early sets were heavy and somewhat finicky, but improvements over time made Beaufighters fearsome guardians of Britain's nighttime skies. Now, given this extensive armament and multi-role capability, the Beaufighter saw a wide range of combat engagements. One of the Beaufighter's most famous roles was attacking German shipping in the Atlantic and North Sea. Crews would come in low, often just tens of feet above the waves, using the element of surprise to unleash rockets and cannon fire. This combination of speed, heavy armor, and stable handling at low altitudes was critical to success. Equipped with rockets or torpedoes, Beaufighters participated in sinking numerous U-boats, especially when the subs were forced to surface to recharge batteries or transit areas with poor underwater hiding spots. The speed with which a Beaufighter could appear over the horizon gave U-boat crews little time to crash dive. Intruder missions were specialized sorties where night fighter Beaufighters would venture deep into enemy territory under the cover of darkness. They aimed to intercept German bombers that were returning to or departing from their bases, effectively taking the fight to the Luftwaffe in its own backyard. These missions were dangerous, requiring superb navigation and timing, as pilots had to locate enemy aircraft or airfields in near total darkness. To appreciate the Beaufighter's role, it helps to look at how it stacked up against similar heavy fighters of the era. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 from Germany performed admirably in the early stages of the war, particularly before Allied single-engine fighters evolved to outclass it. Like the Beaufighter, the Bf-110 was adapted for night fighting, although it faced limitations in agility. Another significant comparison is the de Havilland Mosquito, a British multi-role aircraft renowned for its speed and distinctive all-wood construction. Though not strictly a heavy fighter, the Mosquito eventually fulfilled many of the same duties as the Beaufighter, including night fighting and anti-shipping missions. However, the Mosquito's design approach favored speed and maneuverability, whereas the Beaufighter focused on ruggedness and overwhelming firepower. Over in the US, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning stood out with its twin-boom configuration and impressive range. It excelled in the Pacific and served effectively in reconnaissance roles, though it typically didn't match the Beaufighter's sheer striking power with torpedoes or a quartet of 20mm cannons. By offering a balanced combination of strike capability and night fighter performance, the Beaufighter ultimately filled a valuable niche in the RAF's arsenal, answering urgent calls for versatility on a global scale. As World War II progressed, aircraft technology advanced at a dizzying pace. New radar systems, jet propulsion research, and improved aerodynamic designs were already on the horizon by the war's end. While the Beaufighter remained valuable throughout the conflict, it did eventually give way to aircraft like the de Havilland Mosquito, which could do many of the same tasks faster, and later specialized jets that supplanted piston-driven designs entirely. Still, by the time production ceased, nearly 6,000 Beaufighters rolled off the lines. It served in multiple theaters: Europe, the Mediterranean, Africa, the Pacific, and it left behind a legacy of robust performance, heavy striking power, and surprising adaptability for a plane pieced together as a stopgap. Now, in revisiting the entire Bristol lineage, Blenheim, Beaufort, and Beaufighter, it becomes clear how much these three aircraft collectively accomplished. The Blenheim modernized the RAF's bomber force in the 30s, and even though it was eventually outmatched, it demonstrated the crucial role that speed could play in bomber operations. The Beaufort took that framework and excelled as a torpedo bomber, featuring design elements like a revised fuselage and additional crew positions that laid the groundwork for the Beaufighter. And when the Beaufighter arrived, it became the ultimate multi-role workhorse, serving as a heavy fighter, night fighter, anti-shipping aircraft, and ground attack platform. Remarkably, it was devised as a stopgap, yet it flourished under the relentless pressures of total war. Even though these Bristol aircraft never achieved the fame of iconic designs maybe like the Spitfire or Mosquito, they still embodied the dependable, unglamorous assets that Britain so desperately needed. In that sense, they resembled the Toyota Camrys of wartime aviation. Ordinary, maybe, but absolutely vital in their contributions across multiple theaters, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For those who love precise technical details, the Beaufighter specifications and production figures offer a wealth of insight. Primary users included the RAF, RAAF, Fleet Air Arm, and various Allied air forces, and crew configurations typically consisted of two individuals, a pilot and a radar operator. Though specialized roles could alter the setup, the main variant was powered by Bristol Hercules radial engines, each capable of generating between 1,600 and 1,730 horsepower in later marks. Armament, in its most common setup, featured four 20mm Hispano cannons in the nose, which were often mounted for easy reloading, and six 0.303-inch Browning machine guns that were positioned in the wings, although certain models omitted some of these guns. The Beaufighter could also carry rockets or bombs under its wings, and in anti-shipping roles, it could haul a torpedo slung beneath the fuselage. Typical operation range sat around 1,500 miles with external fuel tanks, making it well suited for extended missions. Over time, several notable variants emerged, including the Mark IF, which was an early night fighter with radar, the Mark IC, a coastal command version equipped with torpedoes, and the Mark VI, which was a main production version that sported improved Hercules engines. There was also the Mark X, which is another key component, which was another key production variant widely used by coastal command. Though raw numbers and performance statistics reveal only part of the story, they still illustrate just how adaptable the Beaufighter really was, even if it never achieved the record-breaking speeds that were once teased by the Blenheim prototype. The Beaufighter struck a highly effective balance of speed, endurance, and formidable firepower. Now, the Battle of the Atlantic is often discussed in the context of convoy escorts, corvettes, and the menacing wolf packs and German U-boats. But what sometimes gets overlooked is the aerial component of that campaign. Coastal Command realized that to beat the U-boats, it had to attack them at sea, preferably when they were surfaced. For a time, the ubiquitous short Sunderland flying boat and the Vickers Wellington bomber, fitted with lay lights, took on that responsibility. But once the Beaufighter joined the fray with rocket projectiles and cannons, it brought the fight to another level. The rocket projectiles gave the Beaufighter the ability to strike vessels with a near instantaneous projectile that didn't rely on a long dive bombing run or the complexities of releasing a torpedo. These rockets could punch holes in U-boat hulls or disable a ship's steering, leaving it vulnerable to subsequent attacks. Now, the additional presence of heavy cannons meant that even if the rockets missed or inflicted only a little bit of damage, the sustained fire from multiple 20mm guns could finish the job, or at least keep the enemy from manning anti-aircraft positions effectively. As for the U-418 sinking, it stands as a vivid example of just how lethal a rocket-armed Beaufighter could really be. Now, one of the strike wing's innovations was massing multiple aircraft for a concentrated strike. Now, instead of a lone plane or pair of planes attacking a convoy, entire fleets of Beaufighters and other supporting aircraft would appear simultaneously. This phenomenon not only amplified the damage, but overwhelmed enemy defenses. The Kriegsmarine had to split its anti-aircraft fire among multiple targets, increasing the attacker's overall chances of success. Beyond U-boats, these wings severely diminished the surface capabilities of the Kriegsmarine in certain coastal areas. They significantly disrupted German merchant shipping, and especially in the North Sea and the Bay of Biscay, which forced Germans to reroute or even abandon a few supply lines. Now, we've mentioned Operation Squabble briefly, but its sheer boldness merits a spotlight. Carried out by a single Beaufighter, the mission was to fly low over Paris, drop a bag of propaganda leaflets, which were often nicknamed nickels, and then beat a hasty retreat back to England. But why bother with such a mission? Well, propaganda drops, though seemingly trivial in a strategic sense, often carried symbolic weight. They demonstrated that occupied Europe was still within reach of Allied forces and could be a morale boost for civilians that were under the heel of the Axis. It also served a psychological blow to the occupying forces, revealing potential vulnerabilities in their air defenses. Now, in the planning stages, the entire idea seemed borderline suicidal. Flat guns, fighters, and the entire array of German detection systems ringed Paris. A single twin-engine plane trying to sneak in and out in daylight might as well have painted a bullseye on its fuselage. Yet, the Beaufighter's speed, range, and reliability gave the Allies enough confidence to attempt it. Sure enough, the mission, it was a nail-biter. Enemy fighters scrambled, anti-aircraft guns opened up, but the Beaufighter pilot navigated skillfully, dropping the nickels and escaped. Now, while the mission's direct strategic value was a bit modest, it still remains a testament to the extraordinary feats that the Beaufighter could pull off. Feats that you might expect from smaller, more nimble aircraft, not a heavy fighter. The Beaufighter is often labeled as a heavy fighter that shouldn't have succeeded, for a few key reasons. First, it began as a rushed stopgap, not the product of a carefully planned fighter program, but a desperate effort to fill a glaring void in Britain's air defenses. Second, it relied heavily on Beaufort components, a design choice that seemed right for performance trade-offs. Most quick fixes in aviation history, as we've talked about plenty on this channel, are overshadowed usually by better engineered successors, if they work at all. Third, engine availability posed a serious concern. When the supply of Hercules engines appeared insufficient, certain Beaufighter variants were forced to use Merlin engines, casting further doubt on the reliability of the plane's future. Finally, the Beaufighter faced stiff competition from aircraft like the Mosquito, which outshone it in some roles, and from single-engine fighters like the Spitfire, whose legendary status quickly captured the public's imagination. Yet, against all odds, the Beaufighter did more than merely survive. It became a cornerstone multi-role platform, shifting seamlessly from nighttime interceptions to shipping strikes, and proving that in total war, speed of adaptation can outshine even the most meticulous long-term planning. For some American viewers who might relate more personally to the individual stories of courage, it's worth highlighting some pilot anecdotes. Pilots who flew the Beaufighter often commented on its stable handling characteristics and appreciated the reliability of the Hercules engines once they were past teething issues. Others wrote about the moment of awe when letting loose the battery of 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns in a ground attack run, an experience akin to riding a thunderstorm, as one pilot described. In night fighting missions, calm nerves and trust in the radar operator were everything. The pilot almost flew blindly, relying on the radar operator's directions. Imagine the darkness of a 1940s cockpit, the hum of the engines, the flicker of instrument lights, and then suddenly, the radar operator calls out, "Contact! Contact! Closing fast!" prompting the pilot to maneuver for a final approach from behind or beneath a German bomber. One or two bursts from the cannons, and the target was often a flaming wreckage. In 1944 and 45, the Allies had the upper hand in the air. More specialized aircraft eventually came along, like improved Mosquito variants, advanced single-engine fighters, and eventually the first-generation jets like the Gloucester Meteor. Still, the Beaufighter continued to find roles, especially in maritime strikes. Now, many served until the war's end, some even continuing briefly into the post-war period before being retired. Following the conflict, the RAF rapidly demobilized or scrapped older piston-engine aircraft to focus on jets. The Beaufighter, despite its heroic service record, had really no place in the fast-modernizing post-war environment, and thus it was largely withdrawn, with only a few surviving as museum pieces or test platforms. But to appreciate the lineage even more, let's remember the company behind it. Bristol Airplane Company was one of Britain's premier aircraft manufacturers, responsible for everything from civil transports to cutting-edge fighters. Now, their work didn't stop with World War II piston-engine planes. Post-war, they were involved in jet engine designs, missile development, and even some early spaceflight considerations. Now, though overshadowed by names like de Havilland, Hawker, and Supermarine, Bristol played a colossal role in Britain's aviation story. The Blenheim Beaufort Beaufighter lineage was just one shining example of how a smaller design house could punch above its weight, adapting quickly to national needs. If you've been following along, you've heard now that the Beaufighter emerged from the Blenheim and Beaufort. which overcame design challenges, served as a night fighter, maritime strike platform, ground attack aircraft, and so much more. It terrorized U-boats. It participated in some of World War II's most daring missions, like Operation Squabble, and remained in service far longer than many ever predicted. It might never achieve the iconic status as the Spitfire or the modern cool factor of jets, but for those that appreciate the nitty-gritty details of aviation history, the Beaufighter stands as a monument to British engineering resilience and wartime ingenuity. And just to kind of end on a lighter note, it really was the reliable Camry in a hangar full of Ferraris and Porsches. And that's exactly why we should celebrate it. Because wars, they're won by steadfast workhorses just as much as the glamorous showstoppers. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the Bristol Beaufighter, a heavy fighter that defied the odds and made a lasting impact on World War II aviation. We hope you found the video helpful and enjoyed learning about engineering feats, daring missions, and the rich legacy of this underrated aircraft. If you appreciate stories of ingenuity and resilience from the annals of military history, we have plenty more lined up. So make sure you hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next exciting exploration. Until then, keep your eyes on the skies.